Welcome to our session in Climate Action Week here for the Houston Climate Action Plan. My name is Peter Kelly Detweiler. I'm Director of Educational Programs for Smart Energy Decisions. And today we're going to be talking about less is more, making energy efficient, equitable. We have with us today Dana Harmon, the Executive Director of TEPRI, the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, and Jared Simon, Director of Business Development for Centerpoint Energy. I'd love to invite each one of you, starting with you, Dana, to introduce yourself and talk for a few moments, maybe 2 minutes or so, about what you do in your organization and how that ties in to what Houston is trying to accomplish with its climate action plan.
Sure, thank you. What an honor to be here, and thank you for having me. And congratulations to all involved who made the climate plan and Houston Climate Week possible. So my name is Dana Harmon, and I lead the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, or TEPRI for short. Our mission is to inspire lasting energy solutions for low-income communities. So through our research, we're accelerating the move towards an energy system that is clean, distributed, affordable, and supports healthy and thriving communities. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based here in Austin. I'm coming to you from my home, but we do work across the state of Texas, including the Houston area. Our researchers work with teams of experts from inside and outside the energy sector to conduct research, to build evidence and develop solutions, and then partner with local jurisdictions to demonstrate and test new models and programs that can scale. Many of the solutions that have been proposed in the Houston Climate Plan can provide financial, environmental, and social benefits to underserved communities in Houston, and even more broadly to the 3.8 million low to moderate income households in Texas who are typically less likely to participate in solutions like energy efficiency and other distributed energy resources due to a whole host of complicated factors, including lack of access to capital, lower credit scores, lower rates of home ownership. And so I think the city of Houston has really made a strong effort to ensure that the Houston Climate Plan is mindful of those disparities and that the transition to a clean and renewable energy system doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities and instead promotes equity as we decarbonize.
Thank you. Yeah, we're seeing that becoming more and more the focus of the conversation in terms of how do we evolve the power grid and all of its constituents and make sure we bring everybody into that game. So Jared, from your perspective, you've been at Centerpoint Energy for a while, and I know you've been involved with a number of efficiency programs. What are you working on now, and how does that tie into the conversation today?
So Jared Simon, Director of our Business Development and Energy Efficiency Programs here at Centerpoint Energy. As you mentioned, Peter, I've been here, just over 13 years and had different roles. I started over these efficiency programs and kind of was over the Minnesota programs as well for a while. And I'm back over this team here. Our main focus is to implement the state mandated efficiency programs that all of the ERCOT utilities are asked to do. We spend over $35 million worth of incentives and administrative fees to help really encourage the public to be more efficient, right? Our incentives are meant to kind of bridge the gap from what's a standard piece of equipment to a more efficient piece of equipment. And, as far as the low-income sector, we're working with local agencies, local religious organizations, even the city of Houston and their groups in order to reach that market and help those customers be more efficient and get their fair share, so to speak, of this efficiency pie. So that's what we're working on right now. It's always a challenge, and I know we'll get into some of this in the question, but it's always a challenge to get to some of those smaller groups and make sure that they are participating at a higher rate. But we're working on it always through these different organizations. So.
Thank you. In our chit chat before the call, which I always enjoy because you get a sense of the people involved. You were talking with Laura Cottingham, who is leading a lot of the city's initiative around this, and she made the comment that you two are in very frequent conversation. What are the things that you're working on directly with the city that relate to this?
Yeah, so we have individuals that are, as you mentioned, constantly in contact with the city. They helped with developing this climate action plan. We also have groups that are a part of Evolve Houston, which is meant to encourage the proliferation of electric vehicles in the city, which directly helps with the climate action plan and greenhouse gas emissions. We have our own carbon policy that we put out there to the public earlier this year that supports a lot of the efforts that the city's doing with their climate action plan. And then, as I mentioned, we are, typically every few years we're creating a program with the city to reach some of these low-income customers. They have outreach to and access to businesses and customers that we don't. So it's always a good partnership to work with them to reach these customers to get these savings out there.
Thank you. I noticed, Dana, on your website, there's a lot of discussion around energy poverty, and in fact, more people slipping below the poverty level. And as the cost of energy rises, this becomes a more and more difficult burden for low and moderate income people to bear. Can you talk to us a little bit about that dynamic and what's happening there?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So we define the term energy poverty as a situation in which in order for a household to consume the necessary energy to lead a healthy and productive lifestyle, so to keep the home comfortable, cool in the summer, warm in the winter, in order to be able to pay utility bills, if it creates a significant or unnecessary economic burden. So I'd like to speak a little bit about just the concept of energy cost burden. Many people are familiar with the concept of housing cost burden and the notion that no more than 30% of your income should go towards housing costs, and anything above that is considered unaffordable. A pretty similar framework can be applied to residential energy costs. And a commonly accepted threshold is that anything above 6% could be considered unaffordable for energy. A recent study conducted by our researchers showed that in Texas, low-income households have an energy burden of 10% compared to about 2% for non-low-income households. So a much larger share of the wallet is actually spent on energy costs. And so then we talk about the energy affordability gap, meaning how much more people paying than they can afford. We actually recently conducted a study in Harris County in Houston, looking at opportunities for distributed energy resources technologies like energy efficiency and like rooftop solar to begin to address the energy affordability gap. And our analysis showed that both technologies have the potential to provide community benefits and reduce energy costs while helping to achieve the city's decarbonization goals. The study showed pretty clearly, we were looking at the residential building stock, so both multifamily and single family residential buildings in lower income census tracts in the city of Houston, or I should say in Harris County. And the analysis showed that the energy affordability gap can be economically eliminated with targeted energy efficiency programs like the one that Jarrett's mentioning. And there are some kind of key factors in making sure that those programs are distributed in an equitable manner, and really making sure that those programs are reaching the people that need it most. I mentioned we also looked at rooftop solar, which additionally has a lot of technical potential in Harris County, but in terms of the economics, energy efficiency was still proving much more impactful in its potential to reduce the energy affordability gap.
Yeah, I can imagine there is a real trade-off in some instances between, do I pay for my electricity or do I feed my family? So if you can actually implement some of these efficiency measures, that money goes straight, sometimes literally into the mouths of the inhabitants in the home. Is it that direct sometimes?
It really can be. And you're right, energy efficiency, I think, is often seen as the least cost resource in, the electric power sector. And it provides an opportunity not only to decarbonize, but also for people to effectively manage their household budgets. And you're right that the money that people can save on their utility bills matters. And you're also correct in that households do make difficult trade-offs. In the study that I mentioned earlier, in fact, we asked, we conducted a study of low-income residents across the state of Texas, so this wasn't necessarily specific to Houston, but we asked if utility bills cause people to delay or skip necessary spending on a list of categories, and the most common responses were clothing, food, transportation, and technology. I should also, I do think it's worth mentioning that during the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that's following, economic fragility is really a leading factor for households experiencing energy insecurity. And so I think these solutions that are sustainable and long-term are more important now than ever.
Yeah, I'm sure that has to be the case. So if one's living in that kind of a situation, very difficult, I would imagine, to scrape up any capital to invest in those efficiency measures when you're talking about feeding your family or keeping the lights on, which is where I would imagine, Jared, some of your programs come in, because there's a surcharge is there on the bill that then helps to pay for these kinds of opportunities, and then through partnerships you reach out and try and affect change. How does that work, and what sorts of measures are you actually implementing at the low income level?
Yeah, so you're right. There is a surcharge on the bill that we all pay into the sort of pot that then is divided into different programs for different groups, right? The commercial, residential, and then the low income sector. That surcharge is based on a KWH usage. So with the thought process being, if you use a lot of KWH and you're paying a little more into it, more. If you're using less KWH, you're paying a little less, so it kind of balances out that way. As I mentioned before, we do work with third parties, so whether it's a local HVAC contractor or ceiling insulation contractor, and then likewise work with the agencies around town that have clients to get the measures out to the customers. Typical measures that are implemented in low-income homes are HVAC replacements, solar screens, ceiling insulation, LED lamps. Those are the most prolific ones. And sort of the way it works, if say Peter, you and I were going to put attic insulation in our home, and say I'm just throwing numbers out there. Say it's $600. Centerpoint pays $250 or $300 to the third party to do the work. To kind of get you to put in more efficient attic insulation, and then you and I would pay the remainder, $250, $350, whatever it is. For a low-income customer, Centerpoint is paying probably $500 to $550 for the same measure, and then the third party is not typically charging the resident for the rest of that. So they are working with us to try and make sure that the resident is getting the same benefits, and then we are paying more to make sure that the resident isn't having burdened with having to pay for that attic insulation. There's but there are other issues that come into play in trying to make sure customers get some of these things implemented. Sometimes the house needs repairs, and our programs don't pay for repairs, so the homeowner maybe has to find somebody, or an agency has to help them find someone to repair the ceiling, so to speak, before the insulation gets put in. And then, there is the burden around how the program is viewed from a cost-effective standpoint. So I gave the example of you and I putting in attic insulation, and it only costs Centerpoint $300 to do it. Well, for the same attic insulation for the low-income customer, it costs $500. So as you can see, it's costing more for the same savings.
Right.
And that makes it sometimes a little more difficult to get more measures and more customers involved in the program. But
thanks. And one other question for you: do the subcontractors come in as Centerpoint representatives, or utilities have a relatively high level of trust among customers around the country? And so I would think, or I'm curious, do they come in as Centerpoint, with a Centerpoint jacket on, or how are
No.
they branded?
No, they come in as themselves, as
Okay.
their own entity. They do, we do ask them to make sure they let the customer know
Yeah.
that they are working with Centerpoint and that they are receiving an incentive from Centerpoint. And honestly, a lot of times that's how they are gaining some trust from the customer to allow them to come into their home and do this work. So they aren't, they can't brand themselves as a Centerpoint employee, but they definitely can brand the program and let the customer know, what they're doing and who they're working with, et cetera.
Okay, great. And I want to follow that thread just a little further because I'm really curious about,
Mhm.
so you go to a church or some organization that's trusted in a low-income community, and a Centerpoint representative is then there with the organization meeting with community members and explaining what they have to offer and getting people to sign up, or what does that initial conversation look, sound, and feel like?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to do it. One way is to have sort of a neighborhood approach where we have, this weekend all, come down to the Civic Center or whatever, and we'll have the agency person there, we'll have a Centerpoint person there, and we'll explain, bring your bill, bring your information,
Mhm.
and we'll talk through, what you can potentially do in this program. That's one way to do it. Another way is to really educate the agency on what we're doing and have them go through their own list of customers and then provide that list back to, the third party that is going to do the work.
Sure.
So, that is the typical way that it's done, because that happens all throughout the year, right? One of the agencies in the Bel Air area, it's the Chinese Community Center. They understand how this program works very well, and they go through their list of need-based customers and provide, bring them to the third party to actually have the work done. But there's a couple of different ways to do it. That we did a neighborhood type approach with the city of Houston, and I think it was Pleasantville neighborhood, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. Where we had a couple of, we're going to just canvass the neighborhood for a few days and see how many customers we can get to participate. So a few different ways to go about it.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
So Dan, I would imagine if you took a sample population of low-income residents versus medium, if you could just somehow get a random sample, that somebody in an upper income bracket would have a more efficient home. That is, there'd be less economic leakage, for want of a better word, which could be actually physical leakage in the form of heat or cooling or whatever. Are there numbers in terms of what those percentages look like? Are there statistics around just how much of that burden has to do from the fact that low income customers don't have the access to the capital to start with?
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's a really important thread. If I may, Peter, though, may I follow up on something that Jarrett just mentioned, because I do think that all of this is relevant. And from the sort of research or the scholarly standpoint, I think what Centerpoint's doing in terms of engagement with the agencies and with community-based organizations, certainly is one of the kind of tried and true approaches to overcoming some of the consumer engagement barriers, because that is one of the challenges. But I also wanted to mention that in addition to programs like Centerpoints, there is federal funding available for weatherization assistance and other assistance. And so, many of the agencies have access to those funding sources as well. There's a program called LIHEAP, which is a low-income home energy assistance program, and the weatherization assistance program are combined. And I wanted to bring that up to mention that I do think that there are opportunities to leverage programs like Centerpoints with other programs that are available, and in some cases philanthropic dollars that may be investing in, may be working to advance climate goals like the Houston Climate Plan. And so if there are opportunities for alignment those programs, I think that there's real potential there. I just wanted to make that comment before I moved on to the housing piece. But you are absolutely right in terms of housing quality being another kind of key barrier to realizing energy efficiency in the homes of a lot of low-income residents. And that manifests itself in a number of different ways. Number one, there's often poor quality housing stock, which is leaky and may be in need of energy efficiency improvements. But as Jared mentioned, in some cases there may be health and safety issues that have that need to be addressed first, even if a resident is interested in one of the energy efficiency programs. Which is a major barrier. Another thing to consider there is also the split incentive issue, where a renter, if a person is renting a residence, the landlord may not have the incentive to invest in energy efficiency if the tenant's paying the bill. And in that case, the tenant doesn't have a whole lot of agency to say, I need new windows in my unit because this is incredibly leaky. And so that's one of the challenges I think that is out there in the market, frankly. And I do think, and maybe Jared can speak a bit to some of the creative things that they've done to try to address some of those issues as well. So I'll stop there for now, but yes, housing quality is a major driver of energy consumption. And I think, frankly, one of the reasons that there is still so much opportunity in energy efficiency investments in a lot of our major cities in Texas.
Thank you. And you've brilliantly anticipated one of the questions that came in, where somebody said, what about low-income residents who are renters and not homeowners? And so I turn over to you, Jared, and say, how does one deal with that community that doesn't even have a stake in the game in terms of their own residence, but is bound up in that dynamic where a third party owns the place that they live?
That is a tough one, right? What we typically do I'm thinking in this framework of multifamily type housing stock, we do try and reach out to the owner of those facilities to see if they are willing to participate in the program. And sometimes they're interested in it, sometimes they aren't. It is a tough nut to crack, and I don't know if we figured out exactly how to get there. I know we're here talking about low income, but that renter owner relationship is an issue across efficiency, whether it's commercial or residential or low income. It really is a tricky one because a lot of times the owner has very little incentive because they're passing all those charges and all those costs to the renter, and it is hard. But we do have some multifamily programs where we reach out to the property owner and try to get them to participate to do some efficiency measures.
Thank you. Way back when I was young, so mid-90s, I was involved in some economic impact studies, input-output modeling around efficiency. And it stunned me how much value the community derived from the savings from these efficiency programs, how much of that money not only redounded to whoever saved it by not spending on their bill, but then those economic development impacts where the dollars stayed in the community, and also the jobs creation. And Dana, we were talking about multiple studies that have shown that investments in efficiency really can impact the local community, and we talked about jobs. Why is energy efficiency so labor dense, for want of a better term? Why is it such a good job creator?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it's one of those economic sectors that is, in truth, often overlooked in terms of its value and its contribution to economic development. But I mean, in short, I think it's just that a lot of the energy efficiency jobs can't be outsourced, right? And so they are kind of like necessarily local. Actually, I wanted to mention Environmental Defense Fund just released a report that was kind of a roadmap for distributed energy resources, and kind of showing how DERs in general and specifically energy efficiency can contribute, if kind of strategically implemented to do so, can contribute to energy poverty mitigation, not just from the energy burden side, but also from the income or workforce development, economic development side. And there's an organization called the Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance that I think just showed that electricity, it just came out in the past, I think, month or two, that showed that electricity customers across the state of Texas could save almost $5.5 billion over the next 10 years by using DERs, including energy efficiency more generally. And there are already something like 170,000 Texans working in energy efficiency, and it's increased 4% since 2018. So this is an important and growing sector. And jobs range from selling and installing Energy Star products to installing lighting and HVAC. So there's a whole kind of host of job opportunities available if we kind of put these pieces together in a meaningful way. And several of the groups that my organization is working with are really trying to work to build an ecosystem of support for communities for STEM education and workforce development by working on connecting local high schools and community colleges and universities with community leaders and energy efficiency companies to develop and deliver training to students so that we can make sure that those workforce development opportunities are available to the communities that need it most. And I think this is another area where it's really important to stress the importance of community-centered engagement strategies, right? So really just making sure that we are working with members of the community themselves and saying, hey, what do you need in terms of economic development opportunities, and how can we work with local school systems to make sure not only is the training available for people who need it, but the jobs are there when those pipelines are created.
Yes, thank you. You pointed me towards that Texas Advanced Energy Alliance study, and you mentioned the 170,000 jobs. A lot of people, when they look at Texas, they look at all the wind and the solar coming in, but it turns out 2/3 of the jobs in the sustainable energy space are right there square in efficiency, which I was really surprised to learn. I have to imagine, though, with COVID, that has had an impact where people can't get into those physical spaces and be proximate with other people. Has that slowed things down a little bit in terms of folks meeting some of the goals and metrics they've been trying to achieve for 2020?
So I've certainly heard anecdotally that is the case with a lot of the energy efficiency program administrators that we're working with. But Jared, you could probably speak to that a bit more than I can for what you're seeing out there in the field.
It's interesting. We haven't seen really a slowdown in the work due to COVID. When it first hit, we were doing a lot of internal discussion, had a lot of discussions about our customers and what's happening with them, and especially in our efficiency programs and what's happening there. But it turns out that a lot of customers are using the COVID time to get a lot of these efficiency projects done. So, give the first 6 weeks where we all had to adjust on how we go about interacting, how we go about getting into homes, how we go about inspecting and doing some of these things. Once that was established, we haven't really seen that much of a slowdown. There's really been a lot of work that's happened. Our programs are still doing well. I think the question or the potential issue moving forward is, I think, is more of an inspection type deal, getting back into a lot of these places to look and see how things are going. But the work is happening, so that's good. That's positive.
So people do adapt to that new normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when you're looking at the programs, and I know you mentioned before that a lot of times when you're making expenditures on low income, there's a lesser portion that comes in from the recipient. But how do you determine, in terms of a rate of return, how to prioritize what gets put into a specific residence and what doesn't? I mean, obviously, something like lighting, big bang for the buck.
Yeah.
Maybe windows, 20 or 30-year payback period, maybe doesn't fit into the mix. How do you, is it a spreadsheet with cutoffs determined? What's the mechanics around the thinking on that?
Yeah, so you kind of touched a little bit on it a little while ago. You could take it boils down to the benefits that are derived from the actual measure. So back to our example on ceiling insulation. Ceiling insulation is expected to last 25, 30 years, right?
Yeah.
So 25, 30 years saving X amount of kWh. And we have these deemed savings factors that it gets multiplied by. That gives you a dollar amount, and say that dollar amount is $700 over 25 years. That's the benefit to the homeowner, society, whatever it is. Well, our payment can't be more than that. So, so I say the 700 because it fits above the 600 we mentioned earlier, right? So that's how the measures are derived. And if you go into each individual home, and we have agencies that do whole home audits for customers, they'll walk through and check off all the boxes that this homeowner may need and assess what benefit they may get by changing out their air conditioner. Maybe their air conditioner is already pretty efficient. Maybe it's a newer-ish model. And they're not going to get as much savings as somebody with a really old model. And so the homeowner with the newer model may not be enough money there to get their AC replaced, but somebody else maybe it could. So it's a case-by-case basis, measure by measure, to see if the benefits of putting that measure in outweigh the actual incentive that we would pay for it.
Thank you. And you mentioned before working with third parties. How do you qualify them? How do you make sure they have people who are going to be polite and represent the programs well, and obviously no criminal, issues to be concerned about? How, because you're sending people out all over the place into folks' homes, how do you qualify the various vendors so that you have a fairly high degree of confidence you're getting what you want and they're representing you well?
Yeah, so each third party, goes through the normal checklist to be a certified HVAC installer, electrician, and whatever other measure, they have to meet the mandates of the Texas code and the systems in place for that. We also have background checks that they have to provide to us to make sure that the people they are sending into homes are reputable. And then, if all of that checks out and we are still having issues with that third party, throughout the year, we will, cut them off or take them out of the program. Sometimes third parties, maybe a project doesn't go exactly how they stated it went, and if that happens once or twice or too often, then we'll make them sit out of the program for a year. Make sure they're completely familiar with the rules, completely understand what is expected of them, and if it happens, too often, then we'll ban them altogether.
So penalty box the first time, and then you're out of the game.
Yeah, you're out of the game. That's right. Yeah.
So often I've found that it's helpful when someone's listening to a conversation, if a panelist can walk them through a success story, like what that looks like. So clearly you've been involved in this game for a while, although I know you were involved in other efficiency programs. What does a success story look like from your point of view? Can you relate a partnership you've had or something that would inspire us and say, yeah, this is the kind of thing that fits really nicely into the climate action plan, and we want to see more replication of these kinds of things? Yeah.
There's other than individual success stories that have happened over the years, we've partnered, as I mentioned, partnered with the city of Houston a few different times since I've been with the company. And to me, working with whether it's a city or an agency or a religious organization, that to me is the best success story, because we get access to a far denser group of population, and the agency gets to work with the customer and understand their needs better, and they have this little box of efficiency. I can help your home be more efficient that Centerpoint can provide. Probably this may have been about 6 or 7 years ago. We had a really good partnership going with Rebuilding Together Houston, and the whole issue of repairs was being taken care of. Rebuilding Together Houston had about 3 or 4 partnerships going, where they had one group go in and repair the home. Centerpoint would go in and add the efficiency, and then I think they had another group go in and do something else. And it really, they were getting $10,000-$15,000 worth of benefit at one home at a time, and that was tremendous. That was really, I thought, was a great partnership that we had back then. But those are the type of successes. It's to me, it's far better when we're going through this with an agency or with the city or some kind of organization to help bring the customers to us.
Where you're leveraging those synergies. Thank you. That's great. Dana, I'm sure you must have some examples too. I'd love one sort of enlightening, heartening example that can help us imagine where this can go. Can you give us one?
Well, so it's interesting because I think a lot of Jarrett's comments I would really echo in terms of the success of our work, and where we've seen a lot of value and value at scale is it sounds funny, but sometimes it's a lot about those partnerships and frankly about putting people in the same room who may not always be talking to one another. So for example, we partnered with the Texas Association of Community Development Corporations, TACDC, not too long ago to host a convening called Empowering Texas Communities. And it was so wonderful to see what happens when you have a group of folks, community development corporations on the ground who are working in their neighborhoods to try to improve, housing, economic development, and the like in those communities. And we had a host of utility and power sector participants, including Centerpoint, was very active in these conversations, and realizing how much was common about the goals of those organizations. And then kind of on a very similar note, we hosted a convening with the TACA, the Texas Association of Community Action Agencies, and many of the agencies in the network that Jarrett is referring to. And kind of similarly, when we come together and we say, okay, you've got this program, I've got this program, we've got some funding over here. Maybe our criteria are different in some cases, but how can we align our efforts so that we can leverage those dollars in a way that can create greater impact in our communities? And that impact may be measured in a host of ways, whether it's kWh reduction, whether it's decarbonization target reach, whether it's energy poverty or energy burden reduction, and being able to kind of talk about how each of those efforts are complementary, I think is really impactful. And the other thing that I'll say is really we've seen tremendous success with in these conversations is, a lot of this can sound, energy efficiency has this tendency to sound cold in a way sometimes, right? Like it's very like building envelope stuff. We're talking about HVACs, we're talking about, savings to investment ratios and all this stuff. But like at the end of the day, it's about the people, right? It's about the people in the homes that we're collectively serving. And I think as long as we keep that in mind, and we think about really from the perspective of the family or the individual that is going to, realize better comfort, be in a more comfortable home environment, who's going to be able to not have to make the trade-offs that we talked about earlier.
Right.
I think that driver is really where we, but at the end of the day, it's why we're doing this work.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it is all about the us, isn't it? So somebody asked, one of the questions, how do these kinds of energy efficiency and equity efforts combine with energy innovation and entrepreneurship? Have either of you seen, entrepreneurs getting into the space saying, oh, I have tools and programs and approaches that are particularly useful and adept in this sector. You're nodding your head, Dana. Have you seen anything that's particularly impressed you in that area?
Well, what's interesting, and I admit that I've talked a lot about kind of this broader topic of DERs, distributed energy resources, in this conversation as it relates to climate action planning and otherwise. And I do think that there are some really interesting models evolving that can, for example, pair home energy efficiency with, for example, access to rooftop solar. And in some cases targeted very specifically at underserved communities or low-income communities that may, as an example, look at alternatives to FICO credit scores, right, in terms of credit qualification. So I think, there's some really interesting things happening where you can almost see this continuum of energy management services, and specifically targeted to low-income homeowners or low-income residents, where you compare, utility assistance when it's needed for crisis mitigation and, helping people to keep their lights on, but then go through this continuum of weatherization and energy efficiency all the way to these more kind of advanced energy technologies like solar, rooftop solar, or demand response programs, or, installing electric vehicle charging stations. And there's this whole host of technologies, and it does feel like there's some neat models evolving where you can pair those things from the perspective of the customer. Admittedly, some of these models that are evolving, I think, aren't necessarily focused on low-income communities yet, but they can be, right? And I think we just need to solve for some of the barriers that we talked about earlier and make sure that we're, very intentionally focusing on equitable deployment of those resources in underserved communities.
Great, thank you. Here's a question specifically directed to Jared that says, we're working to reduce the emissions footprint of consumers and would like to discuss this with Centerpoint. Are you the right person to start this discussion with? And if yes, can you provide your contact information? And I don't know if we want to take that offline or if you're comfortable giving that out.
Yeah, I would say we definitely can provide the contact information. I don't know if that's going to be provided at the end of this anyway. But yeah, we are, it's interesting listening to Dana there talk about, the innovative type things happening. One of the things that our program or the main thing that the efficiency programs in Texas are meant to drive is just that efficiency, right? So it's the efficiency of whatever it is that we're implementing. Whereas, over time, I think the coast, the East and the West Coast, are moving more towards emission and greenhouse gas reduction. And it changes the narrative, right? So it changes the conversation on what measures you can include. And if I change to a GHG discussion, now maybe we can pay for EVs, maybe we can pay for, we're paying for solar, but you can pay for some other renewable type items. But we have, as I mentioned before, we have our own carbon policy that we put out this year. And part of that is our, reduction of our own operations by a certain percentage by 2035, but also the emissions of our customers by 2040. So definitely, I'd love to speak with anyone if they have some innovative, ideas on that, because we have our own goals in place that hopefully will help the city reach theirs as well. But yeah, I'd love to talk to them. I can give out a phone number, but it's probably better to do it at the end and do the whole phone number, email address and stuff. So
great. Okay, thank you. What about
Peter,
yeah, please.
Forgive me for interrupting.
Yeah,
just to kind of add to what Jared was just sharing. I do think that's a really important concept of, as we're looking at KWH, kind of that reduction being the target. And, now we have these GHG emissions reduction targets. And like in that same evaluation, I kind of wanted to give a plug for making sure that we continue to look at energy cost burdens. Because while, and this is most, I think, low income programs, there's often an income qualification threshold which is a very clean number in most cases, but it often doesn't take into account the lived experience of the people in those households, and even just energy cost burden, I think is another important metric to consider as we're evaluating how to align these efforts.
Thank you. That's certainly something we need to continue to bear in mind, and often gets forgotten in that bigger picture. To that end, around the solar piece, one of the things around solar that's become abundantly clear is less than half of all Americans own homes, so don't have rooftops that are accessible to solar. It's because they're living in apartments or their house can't bear solar on it. So we've seen a number of states programs for community solar focused on low income customers. Has anything like that been mooted for Texas yet? And if so, what does that look like? And if not, what could it look like? Any thoughts, Dana?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several low-income community solar projects in Texas now, most of them not in the competitive electricity market, but in municipal utilities or co-ops. In fact, TEPRI is actively working on a project in San Antonio in CPS's territory called Big Sun, which does have a solar assistance component to that project. Here in Austin Energy, who's my electricity provider, has a low-income community solar program that is available. And so there are certainly models out there. Now, in the competitive retail electricity market, it gets a bit trickier because of a variety of reasons, but in part the role of kind of, you've got your transmission and distribution utility and then your retail electric provider, and kind of how does that work in the middle. But it's actually something that my organization is actively working on and trying to figure out how can we make that work. And I believe later in the agenda for Houston Climate Week, there's a presentation on Sunnyside Energy.
Yep, I'll be moderating that, and there is a community solar component on that.
Yeah. And so I think, just as we were talking earlier about kind of different models that are evolving, I think Sunnyside is a fantastic example of a community solar model that is working under the current policy environment in the competitive market, or is being built. And I think it's a really fantastic opportunity to demonstrate what we can do.
It is really fascinating to watch how quickly the concepts and business models are evolving in different technologies. Have you seen either of the two of you, seen evolution around the low income programs where you've seen things from other parts of the country and gone, oh, that's really cool, or actually seen something migrate into Texas? Anything that, that demonstrates room for hope around the areas you're trying to focus on from a financing or some other business model that you go, oh, this is something really cool that might happen. You're smiling again, Dana. What's churning in your mind right now? I get you next, Jared, because I see a smile on your face too.
Yeah.
I mean, so absolutely, right? I think that there's so much opportunity for innovation in this sector. In fact, I mean, so the energy sector is evolving at a more rapid pace than really we've seen in our lifetimes. And I do think that, so TEPRI is about 4 years old now. And when we started doing this work, there was this feeling that, you've got this program in this silo over here, and you've got another program in another silo over here. And, everybody was kind of doing their thing. And frankly, not many people were talking about energy poverty or energy equity. And, these weren't necessarily topics of common conversation. But I would say that has so dramatically changed in terms of the openness to innovation in the sector, in the openness to collaborative partnerships, and saying, how can we work together to better leverage, what, will likely always be limited resources, right, in terms of funding to support some of these initiatives. And how might we think about these problems a little bit differently, so that we can, at the same time, try to meet our climate action goals while making sure that we're meeting those kWh reduction targets and making sure that we're creating a more equitable and sustainable future for our communities. So I'm extremely optimistic about the opportunities that are out there, and I think there are a lot of really smart people working on how we can address some of these issues, which gives me a lot of hope.
That's wonderful to hear. Jared, you were up there smiling. It looks like you got something to add.
Well, I don't know if I have an actual innovative process. You know, in our Minnesota area where we have efficiency programs, they are starting an on-bill type of financing component to help customers finance some equipment. But you know, as Dana was mentioning, you know, in the ERCOT area where you kind of have this trifold of entities, the generation, the transmission, distribution, and the retailer, it's you know, we don't have bills, so we can't, you know, it's hard to do that. I think, you know, we had a conversation, you know, if you remember a few weeks ago, and I brought this up around equity and equality. And I just kind of wanted to mention it again. If there's something for us really to think about for the low income customer and getting more out there for them, I think we have to rethink the idea of if we want to provide low income customers more equity into this efficiency space, we probably can't look at them equally, right?
Right.
You know, which is the opposite of what we always want to do, right? You know, in order for people to have equity, it needs to be equal. But if we go back to that concept of the deemed savings and the idea of, you know, what I'm paying for is going to be viewed as the same type of benefit as a normal house, but I'm paying twice as much, then that doesn't really make sense from a cost effectiveness standpoint. It makes it very, very uncost effective, right? To do low income work. So I think we have to look at it differently in order to say that this low income work is needed. There's a humanistic benefit, as Dana mentioned, that needs to be implemented here, and it's work that needs to be done. So how do we look at it differently to get more done?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Fairness isn't always treating people equal, and nor is economic justice.
Exactly.
And so one question somebody raised here, you got these programs out there, are they oversubscribed, or are there people clamoring to get into them? What does the demand look like relative to supply in terms of the capital and the programs you could offer?
We oversupplied. I don't know if I'd say oversubscribed, but we do end up spending all of our money every year. So we are, you know, fully subscribed. I think what we've learned, and when we talked about the workforce, you know, as we have ramped up our programs over the years, you know, when I started with Centerpoint back in 13 years ago, our budget was only about $14 or $15 million, and we're spending 35 now. So as we ramp up our programs, we actually affect the workforce and the companies that are out there in our ecosystem doing these projects, right? But we you know, over the years you learn to balance, right? And if we put this amount of dollars out, you know, these amount of dollars out there for low income, we'll subscribe it. If we double it, we won't get there. And it's, you know, part of it is just not having enough third parties. Part of it is, you know, you just don't get that many customers every year that want to participate. For whatever reason that is, we just, you know, just doesn't happen. So we fully subscribe, but we don't typically oversubscribe in that area.
Great, thank you. Well, I knew this was going to happen. We flew through our allotted time, got to most of the questions there. I wanted to thank you both for not only a great conversation, but for being participants in an effort to make this better, and for getting engaged in what you do and being involved with the Houston Climate Action Plan. I've enjoyed this conversation about less is more, making energy equitable and efficient, and a plan doesn't go anywhere without the people that help make it happen. And so we do have a call to action here talking about the importance of partnerships, and we need the people to help make this all happen. So I encourage you all to go to greenhoustontx.gov to find out more about what's happening in your own city and your own neighborhood. And I look forward to seeing the progress and the success that both of you, Jared and Dana, make in the years to come. And I'm super thankful that you've engaged with us today in the dialogue. Thanks again so much, and I hope to see continued progress.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.